I will be filling in for Mayor Gilmore until she arrives, hopefully in time for closed session. Before we start, City Clerk, do we have a quorum?
Vice Mayor confirming a quorum.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we have 2 study sessions today. And if there are any members of the public, you're welcome to fill out a speaker card and submit it. You can come and share your thoughts when the opportunity arises. And I don't think there's any other house cleaning stuff that I need to do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the city manager for the first item.
Good afternoon. So this is the first study session of a couple of engagements that we will have with you, but we wanted to begin with providing an overview on cannabis policy, the cannabis industry, and potential regulatory fees and taxes that we'd like to get started on. Our goal for today is to break down the regulatory process and also establish the other path of creating revenue opportunities around this. And so you'll hear us speak to those 2 items, and we're obviously getting started on them. So let's get started. Ruth, I'll allow for you to introduce our consultants.
Good afternoon, Madam Vice Mayor and members of the City Council. This afternoon we have a study session to go over our proposed cannabis policy, but more so from an initial step on outreach and education about what cannabis is and what the commercial cannabis industry is like, to help inform on where we might want to go as far as a policy framework is concerned. So for this afternoon, the purpose of our study session is following on the fall direction from the council to develop a policy. We hired a consulting firm, SCI, and their contract was approved by the council in December. So they are charged with helping us develop strategies for implementation. So the purpose of the study session today is to provide information about the cannabis industry, provide you with an overview of the milestones and the schedule for the development of regulations for here in Santa Clara, and to solicit some early feedback from you to the extent that you have some early feedback that would help inform us as we move forward. So for this afternoon, we have our consultants here from SCI. I will introduce John Bliss, who's the president of SCI, in just a second. But what John will do and SCI will do is their presentation will cover several components. One is give you an idea about cannabis policy implementation, give you a background about cannabis in California in general. I think that some of that will help inform you and understand about where cannabis came from and what the history is like, and then what it might look like here in Santa Clara in the future. Give you an overview of the industries involved in cannabis right now, and then what it might take and what it might look like as far as the preparation of local regulations. So with that, I will ask John if he'll come forward and introduce the other members of his team as well.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, Ruth. Vice Mayor Gilmore, members of the City Council, staff, and members of the public. My name is John Bliss. I'm president of SCI Consulting Group, and I'm here with my 2 colleagues, Sonia Ortega and Neil Hall. We're going to give you about a 20 or 30-minute presentation, and as Ruth said, it's kind of an overview. We're going to give you a little framework of vocabulary, how we can talk about this amorphous cannabis thing, and then we're going to give you a little history, we're going to give you a little operations, and then we'll talk in a stepwise way. The good news is, as we do this process, there'll be lots of time and opportunity for you all to give your input. We're looking for some general direction today, and then we'll continue to communicate. I will say we were comparing high schools earlier today, and I'm a Los Altos High grad, and I got to play some great soccer games against Buxer, Peterson, Wilcox, and Santa Clara back in the day when you had 4 high schools. And I've learned that, I know your city manager is also a Los Altos High School Eagle, and your assistant city manager went to the crosstown rival, the hated Awalt High School. So let's dive in. I tend to talk fast. I'm going to talk very quickly, give you lots of information, and we want to to have plenty of time at the end for questions. So let's go ahead and dive in. So many of you have heard the term 420 or 420. That's the international word for cannabis consumption. We've created our own vocabulary to help people with the structure, and that's 526. And so I'm going to dive in and tell you about 526. It's a framework vocabulary we've created to help people. So first thing is the 5, and so there are 5 commercial cannabis activities that are common. Now, there's subcategories of each of these, but you should be familiar with all of them. The big 3, the famous 3, are retail. That includes delivery, manufacturing, and cultivation. There's also distribution and testing. And all of these can be licensed on the state level, but also require local legislation, or local regulation. We're gonna talk in more detail about those 5 later, and we can provide you pros and cons and tell you what other cities and counties are doing. Within each of those, you also can allow medicinal or non-medicinal, excuse me, actually, I got to look at my slides. This is just a quick slide in case so you aren't blindsided. There's something called a micro business, which is a combination of those, of a subset of those 5. Let me go into this, the 2 in the 526, which is medicinal and adult use. So many agencies here in California that decide to allow some of the commercial cannabis activities, they can decide whether to only allow medicinal or to allow both medicinal and adult use. So we'll give you a little pros and cons, what people are doing on that decision. So that's the 5 and the 2. And then I'm going to go to the 6. These are the 6 elements of a cannabis implementation. We've broken this down. You'll notice as I mention each of these, you've actually performed all of these 6 steps, but for other issues and challenges and services for the city. There's nothing really new here except for the details associated with cannabis. And we're going to walk you through, and we've been engaged by the city to walk you through, with your direction, these 6 steps. And so essentially the first one is community input and outreach. We're starting that today. Sonia is going to give you a little more detail on that. Second one is an ordinance. All local policy is based on the ordinance. That's the Bible. We'll take some input and we'll work on that. The third one is how you decide, if you decide to allow some commercial activities, how you decide which are the most optimal, responsible businesses. Fourth one is what we call full cost recovery. You're familiar with it. It's a regulatory fees. It's the type of Prop 26 fees that you have in place to pay and help you recover costs for all of the work. The fifth one is that's new general fund money. That's a potential tax revenue. And so we'll give you some more detail on that. And then, of course, you ought to be watching what's going on, and we call that monitoring and complying. So that's the 526, just to set that framework. You're going to get lots more information on that stuff, but we like to lead with that to kind of give some structure to the conversation. I'm going to dive in now, and I'm going to, or actually before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about the goals here. We want to balance health and safety regulation, revenue, and accessibility. And so those are the types of things we want to make sure everything is consistent with current state law, as well as workable and meets the goals and priorities here of the city. So let me dive in and give you a little background on cannabis. First, in the USA, cannabis was widely used before 1937. It wasn't known for its psychoactive properties, but it was medicinal. It was a crop to use paper and rope. That's actually, the crop there is actually in Contra Costa County. It was a typical boring crop at the time, not particularly interesting to anyone. Then it became illegal in California right after that in 37, and remained illegal until a big watershed moment happened under the Obama administration in 2013. And it changed the way cannabis is viewed and regulated throughout the United States. And that famous thing was called the Cole Memo. And the Cole Memo was a page-and-a-half memo that basically said that the federal government committed that they would not pursue prosecution of local cannabis operations and commercial businesses in states if they followed 8 specific rules. And the rules were all good ones that you would agree with. No one under 21, no drug cartels, that type of thing. And so that Cole Memo is the reason there's so many states have legalized it since 2013. It had a profound effect. Ironically, it was recently rescinded by Attorney General Sessions, but actually what he did was more political than anything else, because the second half, the other thing that the federal government did in a commitment called the Rohrabacher-Farr amendment said, we're not going to spend any money prosecuting in the states. That has not been changed, and that's still the law of the land. So that's kind of the federal. Those were the two big things on the federal level. And so those caused a legalization trend in the United States. So there's actually 29 states that allow medicinal, and there's only 8 states up there, and that's because on Monday, the state of Vermont became the 9th state to allow recreation, what we call adult use. So that's where we are. They tend to be regional, as you can tell. We're an interesting country, but the western states have a different attitude towards cannabis. So that's where we're at the legal side. But so what was happening here in California? And this is important. There were 4 big things that happened in California that have brought us where we are right now.
Excuse me, John?
Excuse me.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
I had a question.
Councilman
Sure,
Lewis.
I think
absolutely.
it's right. Thank you, Vice Mayor. You mentioned Attorney General Sessions. I mean, Trump's DEA could start raiding these places in Colorado, correct?
Correct.
And they've given indication that they're open to doing that?
No. I would say that I don't agree with your second statement. We cannot.
The question, not
yeah,
the
exactly. So yeah, so I would say yes, absolutely. It remains a federal Schedule I drug. It's a very serious drug in the eyes of the federal government. There has been a fair amount of saber rattling at the federal level. Attorney General Sessions did receive the Cole memo, but I would represent from our vantage point, talking to many people in the industry here in California and other places, that there isn't, people are not panicking. There's not a feeling that the feds are intending anytime soon to go after prosecution. Of course, we are monitoring that very, very carefully, and throughout this entire process, we'll give you all up-to-date information.
And I apologize if it's later,
Sure.
because I think when you bring this up, it's ripe right now about talking about Trump. You know, I know banking is an issue.
Yes.
Is it still true that this is a cash business, or can you use your credit card, et cetera? Because I know this is an issue in Colorado.
Exactly. And so what I'm going to actually do on that question, the short answer is it's primarily a cash business, but we're seeing very positive movement in the right direction on that issue. When we get to Q&A, I'm going to ask Neil to respond to that in detail. It's a great question.
Thank you, Vice.
So let me just continue. So in 1996, Californians voted to allow medicinal cannabis, and that was largely in response to the efficacy, the effectiveness of HIV, or of cannabis for HIV patients. So we were way ahead of the other states when we legalized it, but we regulated it very, very poorly for 19 years. So cannabis dispensaries would pop up and they would be raided, and it was very chaotic. Then in 2015, something very important happened. The state passed 3 assembly bills, which are called today MRSA, and they provided very strong, very well thought out regulation for cannabis. Example, distance you could have a retail operation from a school, how things should be labeled. All of that kind of good regulation came out in 2015 only for medicinal. And just as we're rolling that out, another big thing happens, and that's a year ago, November, the voters of California with Prop 64, they allow adult use. So we're just in our infancy in medicinal, and adult use comes in. Now the good news is, sharp folks up in Sacramento who had written Prop 64 were also very familiar with MRSA in 2015, and so they dovetailed very well. But they still needed some work to get that regulation where it needed to be, and MRSA, for lack of another better term, was passed last year. And it is now mature code. It's over 200 pages of regulation. It's reasonable. The most regulators like it. Most private sector people like it. And it's now manifested in very mature code in 3 places. It's primarily in the Business and Professions Code. That's where most of it is. There's a little in Health and Safety Code and a little in Revenue and Taxation. So it's now mature code that we look at and we rely on every day as we're working. Again, it's state standards that apply everywhere in the state. But the nice thing about these codes is they're set up so that there's a dual regulation, a parallel regulation, so our cities and counties can make their own local regulations as long as they are more conservative or more strict than the state standard. So let me continue. So prohibition in California, we had federal prohibition of alcohol for 13 years. It's still prohibited federally, but California prohibition of cannabis lasted from 51 to 2018, so 67 years. It is, prohibition of cannabis is over, and it's been over for about 3 weeks here in California. So, as you all probably know, the Prop 64, which is a good datum, a good to talk about support for cannabis, passed statewide at 57%. Here in the city of Santa Clara, you're just under 56%. So you're in the middle of the pack in terms of support. And with that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Sonia Ortega. She's going to take you through kind of some operations, just give you a little background. Then she'll go in detail over the first 3 steps of the 6 steps, and I'll go over the last 3 steps, and then we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons and what other agencies are doing hereby. Sonia?
This mic down to height first, foremost. Good afternoon, city staff, council members, and members of the public. Before I go into the presentation, just by show of hands, has any of you been into any cannabis commercial activities? Seen them? Okay. I'm going to take you through a little bit, and I'll slow down since it's the first time a lot of you guys have seen this. We like to consider, of the 5 that we discussed, there's the big 3. Retail, including delivery, manufacturing, and cultivation. The supporting activities we would reference as testing and distribution. One thing that I want to just make a little clear at the time is that there's a difference between distribution and delivery. Distribution reflects the activity of one cannabis from a licensee to another licensee. It's a similar model that you see in the alcohol industry today. When we speak about delivery, it'll be from an actual retail dispensary to the consumer. So just as conversations flow, little things to keep in mind. Cannabis as it's used today, there's different consumption methods. Traditionally, this is what we call traditional smoking, and you'll see it in different patients. What you see on the right there is a package of pre-rolls, which you can purchase from a dispensary. 10% of cannabis consumption in Colorado that we've seen so far typically is in the form of these pre-rolls here that you see. What's growing in popularity nowadays, and I would say it's more so kind of an up-and-comer trending, is going to be what's called vaping. There's different cartridges that you can purchase from these dispensaries. Essentially, it's a wax that when it's heated to about 390 degrees, it creates this vapor form, which is what you see here in the photo, that top right picture. I want to spend a little time on this slide. Edibles, drinks, tinctures, which be things that you can place underneath your tongue, ingestible oils. These are different forms of cannabis. Those photos that you see are even a little outdated. So as John stated, some of the later regulations have implemented very strict guidelines as to what the packages can look like. They cannot be appealable to minors, to children. They have to have marked the amount of milligrams of THC that's included in them. And even in the edibles, prior to some of these regulations that SB 94 created, you would have one serving size, where now they have to be clearly marked and labeled for each serving size and pre-cut that way. So it's a little more straightforward on regulating the consumption. Topicals is another really big use, and you see it mostly in a medical form. So you'll have people that don't want to consume cannabis, that don't want to, bring on any of these psychoactive elements that THC can contain. So they're massage oils, they're, alcohols. There's things that you would see. My grandparents used to use, Bengay to kind of rub out, kinks and stuff, and that's kind of the replacement that you can see in the cannabis field nowadays. I'm going to walk you through a couple images of dispensaries. I will let you know that some of the dispensaries that I've had a chance to visit here in the Bay Area and even in Nevada, one of the things that struck me, is just how clean these facilities are. You walk in, they're straightforward. It almost looks like a medical consultation office at sorts. Before you get brought into the back, you do have to show your ID and identify yourself as an adult user or a medical use in some cases. There's a large variety of demographics that you'll see. This one here is at the Harborside dispensary located in Oakland. And you'll notice, you have middle-aged people, you have elderly people, you have young users that are there for recreational. So it's a variety that you will find. This is what you would call your bud tender. So typically, you have cannabis enthusiasts at the counter, and they recommend, based off of your need, what you're looking for, different selections, different types of cannabis or product of cannabis that you can purchase. This is going to be a cannabis cultivation facility. So as you look in, you have your typical employee, they're trimmers. They can make anywhere from 11 to 15 an hour as an hourly rate. There's different kinds. There's indoor cultivation that you can allow. There's outdoor cultivation. Mixed light is something to consider, and kind of think about your power needs as well. So it doesn't use as much electricity as some other forms do. This is an example of a cannabis manufacturing facility. So we do the monitoring and compliance of some manufacturing facilities in Coalinga. And some of the things that we see is that it's a very standard, straightforward industrial building. Items that you're going to find inside are machinery like that. It's very similar to the pressing of oil, of almonds, to make almond oil. The extraction process is something that you'll see in different industries. This is a little bit on the cannabis plant itself. There's about 85 different cannabinoids that are in the product, or in the plant itself. The two most common ones are THC and CBD. THC being the one that creates some of that psychoactive. CBD is oftentimes used for medical. Another thing that's really specific to the plant that you'll see is terpenes, or excuse me, not specific, but very broad to the plant is terpenes, and they create this odor. Same thing that you find in roses, very similar to what you find in pine needles. So they're elements that are just pretty closely related to other plants, not just specific to cannabis. So we've had a chance to talk about the 5 different activities that you could allow, the 2 being the medicinal or adult use, and kind of getting back to the 526. These, again, are the 6 key elements of implementation. The very first and critical one that we always recommend is community research and outreach. So you want to know what's important to your community. Are there concerns that you have that we could address prior to beginning the ordinance process? Because you definitely want your community buy-in. We've had a chance to work very closely with Ruth and Christine here, thank you, at the city. And so far we have 2 February meetings that will be scheduled, as well as a future stakeholder meeting where we plan to include a little more focus on youth as well. As John stated previously, your ordinance is essentially going to be your Bible. It is your regulations that will transfer into your municipal code. It will allow your applicants to go in and see what rules and regulations you've drafted. They will take into consideration it's different department heads that we'll be working with to make sure that as many steps along the way as we can think of, we've gone through and considered all of those with your team. Once you approve an ordinance, we will work with you guys to develop an application process. So different factors and things to consider as you start to allow these activities, or if you allow these activities, will be, are you going to limit any of them? And if so, how do you decide which is your best applicant? There's lottery-based systems, there's merit-based scoring systems, there's different ways that we could help you guys create an approach to make sure that you have the best qualified candidates in your city working in these businesses. At this time, I'm going to put it back to John Bliss, and he can cover the taxation recovery.
Whoops, sorry, I almost tripped you. Okay, I'm back. Thank you, Sonia. So I'm going to talk just briefly about regulatory fees. So the concept and goal, and we've had success in other cities and counties here in the state of California, developing regulatory fees, Proposition 26 compliant regulatory fees. The concept here is a simple one. We would like to create, if you all decide to allow and regulate some of these commercial cannabis activities, we would like the cost to the city to be fully recovered through a series of fees. Fees tend to be high. They're higher than fees you have seen for other type industries, but I'm happy to report that the cannabis industry can bear those costs and typically does. We're doing one, in fact, for Alameda County, just to scare you off a little bit. Alameda County, we're just finishing up some fees. Alameda County is going to allow 5 dispensaries. An annual fee for a dispensary in Alameda County will be $60,000. That's the type of fee that we're getting, and that will cover things like any additional police, any monitoring and compliance, going in, inspecting the facility, making sure the odor control system works, making sure all the employees are badged and knowledgeable, and all of that good stuff. And so there's 4 kind of main types of regulatory fees that we will be presenting and discussing with you. The first 3 have to do with the application process. Typically, we will have an application process that's 2 steps, initial and final, and then there'll be a renewal. So those fees may range from $2,500 to $10,000 to have your application reviewed. And then depending on the size and the type of commercial cannabis activity, we're going to recommend an annual fee, an annual monitoring and compliance or business license, whatever we end up calling it, we would, and that should cover all your costs. In addition to this, we're recommending and we're working with staff that in parallel to that, that you propose a tax to your voters, and that tax will be perhaps on gross receipts or square footage, something like that, and that would be new revenue to the city, to the general fund. I will give you some sobering news in that we always our firm is fairly conservative, and so as we work with you all and make some estimates on the revenue, some agencies, some public agencies in California have been told very high revenues from taxation, and we would just give you, advise a little caution on that. We will develop those, but they're not as much. They are typically have not been as high in terms of local taxation as was originally reported. So we'll give you some more information on that. I'm going to go and then real quickly, monitoring and compliance, this is kind of the overlooked one. It's very, very important, and it has two real components. One is the day-to-day, almost like a code compliance, where you all will send in people and you'll make sure that these industries, because they are special businesses, are performing according to your local regulation and state regulation. At some point in the future, the state may take over that, but that's not going to have to do that. So that's kind of the day-to-day. But equally important as monitoring and compliance is to be looking at the effect of cannabis community-wide, in case you want to make some changes or adjustments and that kind of thing. There's a wide variety of ways to do that, but you'll want to work with police and even emergency rooms. All of that kind of data is available, and you'll want to be monitoring that. That's an important step that's often not talked about. And so, again, the common approach is this, is you've seen this list before. Just want to kind of go over very, very rapidly some of the things to consider. Retail is the one that is the most intrusive by far. An urban city like Santa Clara would probably, you all would put most of your brain power and focus on making good decisions towards retail because it's the front end. Retail can include delivery, and you'll want to discuss the pros and cons of that. You can even have retail locations. They're required to have a brick and mortar location, but only do delivery. They don't have a walk-in. So there's a variety of things to look at there. The other thing unique about retail is that in most agencies, there's no requirement to do this, but in most agencies in California, they are limiting the number of licenses for retail. So many of our clients say, well, we're going to allow for something we've determined empirically that we've seen. So that's something, and as Sonia said, if you go down that road where you limit the number of retail, you'll want to have a good, fair, transparent process in place so that, because you would likely have today or a rural county, we spend the whole afternoon talking about cultivation. Cultivation is a dominant theme in rural California, but retail is the dominant theme in urban California. Outdoor cultivation would be totally inappropriate here in Santa Clara. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that, and we're open to it. But indoor cultivation is common in San Jose and Oakland. Many of the light warehouses around the Oakland Coliseum now have indoor cultivation. It can be well regulated, well managed. Odor is one of the issues, and there's great systems for that. It's something you will want to consider. Then there's the third type, which is we call mixed light, which is a fancy way of saying greenhouse. That also may be appropriate. The nice thing about greenhouse is it uses less power than indoor, and so it's becoming an attractive alternative. Our crystal ball says ultimately, almost all cannabis in California will be grown in greenhouses. It's a production flower. It's really a cut flower. So you think of Half Moon Bay, all the production flower and all the greenhouses there. That's the type of place that cannabis is probably the most efficient. Distribution is the boring job of transporting from one commercial cannabis to the other. Distribution is a state-required step, so it's not something that is made up by the private sector. It's required right in the law that a distributor has to transport it from one to the other. The distributors also have two very important roles. They have to collect the taxes for the state, and they're required to do the testing. So the distributor model, that distributor is very, very important. Now, the state has recently decided that a manufacturer, cultivator, retail can also be a distributor, so they can hold both licenses and do both things. So that's why we talk about distributor. Testing is like any kind of testing lab. It's fairly unintrusive. It's like a bunch of scientists with white coats looking in microscopes. It's a fairly good business. There doesn't need to be a lot of testing labs. There are already a number of them in the Bay Area. And so let me talk a little bit about some of the local approaches what we're seeing. So as you all know, on January 1st of 2018, 3 weeks ago, the 67-year-old prohibition of adult cannabis use ended in California, and it rolled in with a whimper, not a bang. There's lots of cities that wanted to be ready to go on that day. There were very few. There weren't super long lines like we saw in Nevada. It was a different rollout and a pretty good rollout. The state did a very good job with it. But over time, we're going to see more and more commercial cannabis activity. You all are very close to San Jose, and San Jose has been one of the leaders traditionally. They've had their challenges and taken their knocks, but they've made a lot of good decisions as well, and so that's an area you're right next door to, and so that's going to affect your policy. Throughout the Bay Area, there, believe it or not, aren't a lot of other cities, particularly here in Santa Clara County, that have allowed it. Oakland is famous, San Francisco is famous, Emeryville, Berkeley, those types of cities. So there's lots of good lessons to be learned from those areas. But we will continue to report and take input from you and the public, and we're in constant contact. We work with a lot of them. City of Alameda is rolling out now. They're one of our big clients, as is San Carlos. So we have a number of clients here in the Bay Area, and we want to share that knowledge with you. With that, I am going to end and open for questions and answers. And actually, Neil, if you wanted to come up and give a little overview on banking and cash-only issues, where the state is at for those type of things, and then we'll open for questions.
Thanks, John. Council members, good to see you all again. Neil Hollis, CI Consulting Group. With the banking, I was in a dispensary week before last, and they were taking credit cards. We find that they're becoming very creative in what they're doing. I forget what the dispensary was, like the ICH dispensary. And so the banking industry was not aware that they were involved in cannabis. And a lot of these folks are doing that the same way that a lot of them are using temporary employment agencies to go through for their employees so that they can pay all their federal taxes, Social Security, that type of thing. So we see some creative solutions to this. But cash is still primarily what's used. In some cities we work with, and we work with cities, by the way, we're working with about 20 different cities and counties here in California, from city of Shasta Lake up north all the way down to Encinitas and La Mesa down in Southern California. Some of the cities meet the dispensary folks at the bank where the city does their banking. Some of the smaller cities do that. They simply sign an invoice for it and hand it right to the bank in the bank. Others use armored car services. We see this in Vallejo and some of the other cities. We'll work with the city of Santa Clara to figure out what's right. You want to look at the timing of those activities. If there's a lot of cash flowing, you may want to do it on a bi-weekly basis. You may want to do it monthly. You may even want to do it quarterly. It's now the California Department of Tax and Fee Agency, I believe, the CDTFA, that is responsible for collecting these taxes, and they're going to start testing shortly with some of their regional offices in different areas of the state, collecting cash as the CDTFA, because of course they have to collect the state taxes on this. So we're seeing a lot of different movement. We've heard the state treasurer, John Chang, talk about a Bank of California that will handle it. We're kind of skeptical about whether that will work. Hasn't really worked anywhere else. So, I mean, the ultimate solution is that the federal government will realize there's a multi-billion-dollar industry here that that needs some banking. So we'll see how that works out. I'm curious, what questions do y'all have? We've gone through a huge
wants
thing.
to conclude their stuff. I got everyone out of order, so I apologize.
So just before we go into questions, which I'm sure you'll have questions for our consultants, just wanted to wrap up our presentation with kind of giving you an overview of the scope and where we're at. So currently, right now, we've just kicked off the process. We're in this what we would call research and initial assessment stage. So we're working to provide a lot of information to our consultants using our GIS layer so that they can locate where our schools are and our sensitive receptors are, taking a look at where we have licenses for childcare, and then we're going to start and to launch out on our outreach. So our outreach really is, at this point in time, we're going to go into 2 phases. This first outreach phase is really about an educational perspective to give people an understanding of the cannabis industry, similar to what we're doing today, so that to take the black box out of the equation, if you will, so that they understand what we're talking about and get some early feedback from the community. As Sonia mentioned, that we're going to do we have some meetings. We've just tentatively scheduled 2 community meetings during the week of the 12th, and so we'll be pushing out information to the public if we start moving it from a light pencil to a darker pencil. But right now we're looking at February 12th to have a meeting here in the council chambers at 6 o'clock, and then one at the library on the 15th at 1 o'clock, trying to get both business interests involved during the daytime and residents involved in the nighttime. And again, this first part would be really on an educational perspective. We also are looking at targeted meetings for those that are involved in schools and in youth. The district is here today to listen to our overall just general background on cannabis. And we're going to continue to work closely with the school district as we develop the policy. The next major thing is then after we've done this initial outreach that we'll be working to develop some draft regulations. Given all the feedback that we have, looking at our land use maps, looking at where our sensitive receptors are located, what kinds of policies seem to make sense, and then starting to go through the CEQA analysis necessary in order to bring forward a regulatory framework for you to consider and potentially adopt. So before we bring it back to you, however, we're going to go through a second round of outreach to make sure that to at least advise the public and hopefully make sure that they're comfortable with the proposed framework. So we'll provide that with that information, solicit feedback, and then go through the process of going through to the Planning Commission and to the Council for action. So that's one kind of big bucket of work. Another bucket of work, as was mentioned previously, was to take a look at the development of a fee recovery. So what's it going to take for the city to implement this program, and then for us then to establish a fee associated with those users to recover our costs. So we'll be looking at what that would take in the April and June timeframe. And again, bringing that back to council, and then looking at the preparation and the possible strategies associated with a possible tax measure. And the tax measure, we would be targeting for November 2018, but we've got a lot of milestones that we're going to need to hit early on in order to make sure that we get on the ballot. Additional policy and program development that we'd be looking at is identification of the staffing and the resources necessary, not only from an implementation phase, so that once we develop a policy and we decide that that we would like to have a few licenses available for, let's say, retail, then what kinds of staffing would we need in order to make sure that we do appropriate backgrounding, that we do appropriate checking on a regular basis to make sure that the licensing is good, that they are adhering to our regulations. These kinds of things are staff intensive, and so in the development of fee, of course, we're going to need to understand what those costs might be, but then we are also going to need to come back and let you know what that framework and what that work effort is going to look like. We're going to need to develop policies on monitoring compliance, the cash management, which we talked about. And then along with that, we've talked in general about modifications to our city smoking ordinance. So this is going to be a concurrent path. So in the city manager's blog, the last blog that went out, we included a note that we put online polling available, online surveying available to the public to respond to questions about our current smoking ordinance. And right now, I can report that there is overwhelmingly in favor of looking at our smoking ordinance and to create additional restrictions that would prohibit smoking in public spaces as well as in multifamily buildings. So it's a cross-departmental effort. So whereas the city manager's office is right now looking at doing some overall coordination, all of many departments in the city will be engaged in the overall development of this policy. And then when it comes down to it, they'll be engaged as well as the implementation of a regulatory framework. So some of the things that we're interested in hearing from you, if you have any particular concerns or any perspectives right now, is the engagement of certain areas. We talked about retail and delivery components of commercial cannabis. Is that something that we want to continue to look at and develop a policy and framework for? Are you okay with looking at manufacturing, a policy framework for that, policy framework for cultivation? We will bring back to you future recommendations on staffing, as I mentioned, and we would also, as our consultants suggested, want to take a look at and are asking if it's okay to bring back a policy framework that would allow for just a minimal number of licenses to start up with and allow us to ramp up, to learn from those initial licenses and allow us to ramp up over time. I think even in cities such as San Jose, maybe not so much San Jose, they went the other way. They went from a large number down to a small number, but certainly in the city of Oakland, they started at a smaller number and then they've been ramping up over time. And then, and any feedback we have on, and you might have on the modifications to the city's smoking ordinance. So with that, we're available for questions.
Thank you. Appreciate the presentation. I have a couple of lights here, and I will start with Councilmember Caserta.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. In real estate, they say location, location, location. In cannabis, I think retail, retail, retail. So I want to look at storefront and non-storefront delivery. My question is, we put this on the ballot in November. What if the voters don't vote yes? Has that happened? And then I'll let you answer that
Yeah,
first.
great question.
I know.
It really hasn't. So it's a cannabis tax is a different type of tax than we typically have. And the reason for that, it's fascinating, and we'll give you some background. There have been a few that have failed, but overwhelmingly they have passed. One of the nice things about November of 2018, it's a general election, so we're going to be recommending that you do it as a 50% general tax to go into the general. So that makes it even more likely. Most of them in the state have passed it in the 70s and 80s, and the reason for that is people that are supportive of cannabis are they're glad that cannabis isn't very expensive. The tax is not a big factor on them. It may be a couple bucks, $3 or $4 on for local taxes on a typical purchase, and so they tend to be supportive. And folks that aren't comfortable with cannabis, even many of them say, "Hey, I don't like it in my community, but once it's here, I would like to have it get some revenue." I
agree. I think in Santa Clara the numbers were north of 60%
Yeah.
for Prop 64. But my other question is. I know through DDAs we can collect fees as well. Can we do these parallel, or do we have to wait for the measure to pass?
Great question, and Neil and I have worked, and there's really three ways to do it, and all three work. One of them, many of our clients will pass the ordinance, get everything ready to go, and then before the tax goes out. And they can even have language in the ordinance or the regulation that says this will only come into effect if the tax passes. Some of them are actually doing it at the same time. Occasionally, we don't really recommend this. Occasionally, I think the city of Hayward actually had their ordinance as part of the tax measure. We don't recommend that, but we can have them linked. Or there are some areas, in fact, a number of areas, particularly in more conservative areas of California, they went ahead and passed a tax, believe it or not, and said that it's banned here, we're going to pass the tax, and we may allow it into the future. So we'll look at we'll discuss with you all and staff all three models and approaches. But the important thing to know is we would represent to you that there's a high likelihood if the tax is presented reasonably here in Santa Clara that it would be supported, and that we will provide linkage between the ordinance and the tax so that it all rolls out in a reasonable and effective way.
Yeah, Ms. Shikai, I can't speak for my colleagues, but I really agree that we should look at both there and hit it with the ground running. And I'm excited that the staff is being expeditious in this. It's a fledgling industry. And right now, I mean, look, we got airfield that's literally 1/80th of a block from our city. And San Jose is just, taking revenue in that. It's literally 5 yards away from our city. So let's capture it. I'm really fired up about this. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Caserta. Councilmember Mahan?
Thank you, Vice Mayor Watanabe. I had a couple of questions more on the enforcement side. You had one slide that mentions you'll be reaching out to public safety and all the other planning department and so forth as stakeholders. So what are you going to do with the results of that input? Then secondly, have we calculated at all, or will we be calculating the added costs of enforcement, i.e. with our community development, planning, building, code enforcement, with our public safety, with police and fire? Are we going to develop a policy for drug driving? Is there a reliable test for testing for drug driving? And then how do we recoup those costs out of the tax? And is there a way to tie the tax and make sure that we can earmark tax revenues for additional enforcement costs so it at least stays neutral to our general fund?
Right. You've asked a number of things, and I'm going to do my best, but please speak up if I forget to respond to some of the things that you brought up.
At one time.
So in general terms, the goal of our effort and the city's effort is to recoup and get full cost recovery for all of the direct costs associated with commercial cannabis activity. For example, part of the process of developing those regulatory fees, it's a requirement, we would be working with staff for all the different departments that you talked about, identifying what are their tasks, and we put hours and rates to them, and we generate those, and we can generate, our firm tends to be well within Prop 26, we tend to be aggressive. We want to capture all those costs. So our goal
Does
is
that include drug driving costs, enforcement costs?
No. So I want to limit that. So I want to be realistic with this, and that is, and this is the model that I give, and that is if any costs associated, let's think of a new retail location. Let's say there's an issue with loitering or crime associated with that retail position. All of those costs can be incorporated in a fee paid for by that dispensary.
And so you have experience on what that average cost will be?
We do. Okay. So that's one of the services we will provide. I would say we're the strongest in the state on that. But I want to give a caveat, and this answer is realistic, but is not as palatable. If we had an illegal dispensary across town, we cannot, and we have police and enforcement costs associating with closing that down. We cannot include those costs on this legally operating dispensary over here. So the costs of enforcing drugged driving, and there isn't a good test right now. There hasn't been. There's lots of people, unfortunately, lots of Californians that are abusing a lot of drugs and driving right now. That's not going to change, probably not going to change much with the new regulations, but it's a real cost to the city. And so those costs would have to be covered in the way they are traditionally covered today.
So in other jurisdictions, haven't there been experience where once cannabis is legal that those drug driving situations have increased and they drugged in public, smoking outside, in the public park and getting under the influence?
Great question, and you're going to accuse me of a consultant speaking out of both sides of my mouth because I'm about to do that. And if we look in Colorado, we can find equally as compelling evidence that they've increased as we can that they have not. So the conventional wisdom, I would say, we would say that particularly here in Santa Clara, we would not say in our crystal ball that you would get a significant or maybe even a measurable increase in those types of things if you open a couple of dispensaries. We think that effect already exists and you're not going to see a growth. But if there is, we will put protections in place to take a look at that, and we will want to monitor that very, very closely. But I hesitate, and again, I apologize for sounding like a consultant, but I can't say definitively to you one way or the other that there's clear evidence that there's that impact. Neil, do you want to add anything to that? Or how did I do in that dance? It's a tough
But
one.
what
It's
kind
a
of
tough one, but
protection, what
we
kind of
just don't know.
protections can you build in? Because once you pass the tax, you're not going to get a second bite of the apple just because you do experience an increase in those sorts of enforcement costs. So how do you bake that into your first go-round to get the tax passed to make sure that it, at least on the enforcement side, it does stay revenue neutral and doesn't impact adversely our general fund?
So let me actually take a step back before I respond to that, because there's a larger question that you as a council will have to answer, and that is, we recommended, so first of all, we're going to try to have the regulatory fees give you full cost recovery for the commercial impact. But there are other types of impacts, perhaps related or unrelated, to you all regulating commercial cannabis activity. For example, a drug driving thing. Those costs can be paid for out of different sources. If you do a tax, but they can't, the example you gave is one that doesn't lend itself well to a regulatory fee. So what other sources are available? And you mentioned the tax. We would recommend at this time that you consider a general tax, and a general tax means, in California state law, that we don't specify how the revenue is spent. It can go into general fund and it can be used as you direct it, but we can't specify it if we do it as a general tax to get that 50% threshold. If you all
people
decide,
don't know though, it's
Excuse
going
me,
to
I'm
come
sorry,
from.
the city attorney would like
Sure.
to.
Sorry.
I just wanted to
Thank you.
clarify a few things and make sure that, because I think you walked in a little bit late, and so there's two parts to the revenue picture here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But the first goal is to have regulatory fees,
Yes.
which can be full cost recovery.
Right.
And we'll take a look at the maximum we need to run the program. I think what the consultant is saying is that there may be a limit in terms of how much we can, through a regulatory fee, use those funds for criminal enforcement
Right,
of
I
people who
understand that.
aren't within the regulatory program.
I understand that perfectly.
So our
right.
goal will be to fully recapture all of the regulatory costs, except perhaps for people who are,
Correct.
violate criminal laws. In the balancing that we'll have to do in terms of determining what kind of tax to put on the ballot is what the consultant is trying to communicate now, and I think it's important that the whole council understand. There's a difference between a special tax and a general tax. If we choose to go for a special tax, which won't guarantee full cost recovery, it'll just be an estimate of, this is what we think is going to cost extra for our police department to deal with this.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to
If we
get
tried to
at.
do that, you're right, we could guess wrong. And the problem with trying to do it that way is by earmarking it in the ballot measure for police enforcement of the program, you're saying it is by law a special tax and therefore will need 67% to pass. And I think that by simply doing it as a general tax into the general fund at a reasonable rate with, thoughts in our head that we could use this extra revenue towards some of the enforcement, that it would be more likely to pass and we'd have enough revenue to deal with it.
So the general or special tax, what would that be a tax on?
It would be a
Just
tax
the
on the sale.
on the cannabis
yeah.
sales, retail sales.
The sale of the product,
actually,
yes.
let me add to that. We would recommend that you consider placing a tax on every step in the supply chain that you consider. For example, this won't happen, but let's say I was in Tuolumne County, as I mentioned. They're all about cultivation. Their tax will be on cultivation because they're not going to do much retail. It's a small county. So our tax methodology typically puts a reasonable, transparent, easy to identify tax on cultivation, manufacturing, and retail, as well as the distribution step in between. And occasionally we even recommend a tax on testing. There's not a lot of money in testing, so we usually don't, but that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you. That both
Okay,
helps
thank
a
you.
lot. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Councilmember Davis.
Okay, so as I'm getting this, City Attorney, so we're going to put the ballot, this is going to go on the ballot for the voters for tax. So this will be point of sale tax, correct? Is that how we're doing this?
I think there's different ways of which points you assess the tax depending on which
Okay,
activity
so
is
it would
taking
be
place.
the purchase, and it would be anything included, ointments, rubs, food, any of that, correct? That would all be incorporated into this tax.
Absolutely. We're really
That's
early
point
in
of
the
sale to
process.
me.
Yeah, we're
Okay,
really early in the
great.
process, but we will generally recommend, and I'll just shoot from the hip a little bit here, for retail, as you say, all retail sales would be subject to a tax. Typically, it's a gross receipts tax, which is another way of saying a sales tax. So it's a percentage through the cash register, very similar to sales tax. But we will also probably be recommending to you that you put taxes on other steps in the supply chain, either based on gross receipts, square footage. Occasionally we do weight. We probably won't in this case, but some of the other things. And each of those brings with it an administrative and collection burden, but those burdens are far lower than the amount of revenue generated.
So, all right,
But
go ahead.
what we put on the ballot is your decision. So we'll
Yeah.
come with recommendations. We'll talk about pros and cons of each of these options, and then ultimately you will be presented with a decision to make, and we'll process that accordingly.
Okay, so as a consultant, I would like to really see how you're going, like point of sale, and everything that involves anything that has THC in it. So that way we're basically
Yeah.
covered.
Yeah,
Food,
absolutely.
I
Yes.
mean, even clothing, if we're gonna get into the hemp world. So,
Yeah.
that's how I'm kind of looking at this.
Absolutely.
Because to regulate this and to get as a revenue stream for the city, I'm kind of looking at, let's cover all the bases in one shot. Okay. Second, I know I bought a banking before, and that is a big thing for me. And when we were talking, I just kind of got a little in my head, creative financing. So when will we know how the state is going to look at this banking system? Is that going to come in this, you gave us a timeline. So did you tell me, was it June or May or something, that you would be able to give staff a better idea of the banking process?
We are, one of our products to you, one of the services we're going to provide is a big cash management policy recommendations.
Okay.
We can't represent to you today when the state will deal effectively with the cash issue. One of the things I wanted to add on to what Neil said is what he was focusing on is cash paid from a commercial cannabis business to the city, either as a regulatory fee or as a tax. Both of those would be revenue from that business here to the city. And today, a lot of it, as I think you all know, is done through tax. I will give you an example of the city of Vallejo, who they collect theirs on the 20th of every month. And believe it or not, one of their 8 dispensaries, someone will come in with a printout of all their sales for that month, the percentage, and they will hand cash. That is a management challenge. The cash often has real significant odor issues. So there's administrative policies. We will help you with that. But there will be...
Just don't want big bags of cash.
Yeah, exactly.
Coming
right.
to City Hall.
Absolutely.
I mean,
and so we understand that. Neil said there's a number of workarounds, but the ultimate solution is, and we see this coming, but we cannot guarantee when, that there's got to be other methods other than cash. We know those are coming. We don't know what they'll look like. We don't know when, but they are coming.
I'm very curious about how this is going to go. Okay, next question. City manager, I guess this is going to be your issue, and you're going to, after community meetings and talking in-house, what FTEs we need for this, how police and fire are going to be covered. I mean, I think going on Council Mahan's thought process was, how are these cost recoveries going to hit us and impact us? We just had a 2-day strategy session. We're kind of like a little overwhelmed here. So I want to make sure that whatever this is, that the consultant comes back to you with realistic numbers. And then also regionally, okay, so there's 15 cities in the South Bay. And I'm kind of wondering, in your communications as stakeholders, have you talked to other cities about what they're doing or how they're doing? Because we border a bunch of cities. And if some of those cities are against this, it might be beneficial to know that information.
Absolutely. I would say informally and anecdotally, mostly Neil is a giant in the cannabis policy in the state, and so he has his eyes and ears and feelers out. We know staff and you all, there's, I would say, a good but imperfect flow of information with the other cities. We're working with a number of the cities on other issues as well. So we have our eyes and ears open, and we will report that. And you're absolutely right. We have this issue in the Central Valley where we'll help a city, and then the next city over wants to do the same thing. And so, and it has a real dynamic marketplace feel. All of this is going to shake out, and what tax rate you go at may be affected by a city. So we will continue to communicate on that, but it is an imperfect and dynamic situation.
City manager.
So the city managers, county group got together and established its priorities and areas that we wanted to focus on, and this was an item that we put on a watch list. We meet monthly, and so as our changes begin to roll out, as well as the other surrounding county cities, we'll share that information and bring that back to the council.
Okay, and then last question. Retail, I would like to really know where we're gonna hit this, and I guess that's your job. So light industrial areas or whatever, I'm concerned about the schools, and I'm really concerned about the smell. That kind of, I just happened to have my garage door open the other day, and somebody walked by blowing a J,
Yep.
and I gotta tell you, the smell just like whacked me in the face. And I was like, wow, and my husband said, well, honey, it's legal. But it was just, the impact of that was like a contact high, so it was interesting to me. The land, we have 19 square miles. If we're gonna do indoor cultivation, I'm really curious as to what kind of venues we have to put this in, if it's an indoor, I guess whatever we have around here. Buildings, we're not Oakland, but we do have buildings that are open. Greenhouses, you kind of brought that up, but I know we don't have that around here. And then the state requires us that we do have to do distribution. So are we doing that as we speak right now? Because San Jose has 16 distribution points. So how is that, are we doing that right now? I mean, even though there's distribution going through our city, don't we have to allow that?
Yeah, so again, distribution is a required task. It can be a physical location where growers and manufacturers bring product and then it is distributed to retailers, but it's really, think of distribution as a required step or task. How this likely will play out in California is, and I know San Jose, and I hope no one's watching from San Jose, those distributors, that task will likely over time just become another responsibility of the grower, the manufacturer, or the retail. They'll get that also, that particular license, and they will have to perform the required tasks of distribution, which is testing and taxation collection. And so I don't think, at this point, I don't think it's likely that there will be a big warehouse of distribution. That model was what was originally thought of, but we don't see it playing out like that. We think it'll go straight from a grower to a manufacturer. It'll be delivered. They'll pay the taxes and do the testing in between on a sample, but it won't actually sit in distribution, though distribution will remain as an important step in the process.
Okay, those are my questions.
Come on up. Come on up.
You brought up the land use issue, Ms. Davis, is that we will be also working with PlaceWorks. They're not here today, but Charlie and Tanya has been working closely with the city's GIS team, and they will be identifying more so the land use locations and giving you direction on what they feel is best fit for the city.
Well, I'm glad you're using GIS because that's going to be the optimum use so that we see what is out there and what you're going to uncover, because there are, you know, different companies that have different things, and we do have schools that are in light industrial areas. So yeah, we will have to take a look at that closely.
Right, and the state has very strict requirements about distance from school. We're going to we will look at that. We tend to be very conservative, so we tend to actually encourage a even greater distance from schools, and we would probably do that in this. That's a very important part of it. And we usually go with very strict regulations around schools.
Okay, thank you.
I just have a couple of statements. For gathering the information from the public, will you use that information then to help put an ordinance together then that you will bring to us? That's the plan?
Yeah, so the easy answer to that is yes, we give them in not a dissimilar format to this. We haven't made those decisions yet, but we like to give information, share with that, and then take input. The input from the public, from our experience, from staff, and from you all will all go in, and other stakeholders in the area, maybe some private sector. So all of that will go towards the recommendations that we'll make to staff, and then they'll make to you and get direction from you on that.
Right. And then there was just one other statement I wanted to make. You mentioned earlier about how Vermont has now legalized recreational marijuana. I heard that they actually didn't do it with a ballot. They did it legislatively.
You are correct, yeah.
Yes, and
They're the
so-
first state to do that, yeah.
Yes,
It was
exactly.
the governor signed something, and I apologize, maybe someone here knows, there was some, it was done legislatively, the governor signed something either Monday or over the weekend, but there was some caveat involved in it, so I'm not sure how that's playing out yet.
Yeah, I haven't read it. I just heard about it for the first time today. However, they said the ordinances that they put together are very strict, and I would be very curious to know what they put together.
We'll look at them, and
Yes.
our general tone is very strict. So we tend to be a pretty conservative firm in terms of that. We have a good reputation and relationship with the private sector. We want to be reasonable. Whatever happens here in Santa Clara, we want to have it succeed. But we also we're heavy on regulations. And I apologize, I called you Vice Mayor Gilmore, you're Vice Mayor Watanabe. I apologize for that.
People are getting used to my title.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. I connected the dots, I apologize.
Thank you, John. No,
Okay.
no worries, but thank you. I have two cards here, but I don't know if they are for this particular item. They're meant 2B. It states 2Bs. Okay, so that's the next item. Would anybody like to say anything? This is an opportunity for public comment.
Good afternoon, Sean Kelly Rye, registered lobbyist with the City of Santa Clara. Thank you for your time. Thank you for moving this quickly. I mean, frankly, in dealing with Ruth, there's been a timeline, there's been constant contact, there's been a lot of interaction with staff, so it's been fantastic. I've had the pleasure of dealing with Neil and his staff in the City of San Carlos, and I will just mention this. San Carlos had a great process. They went to the community, they did polling, they came back and they looked at the potential of all of the industry. The council then decided that they wanted to do everything but retail, even though the polling showed that they could do 3 or 4 dispensaries, according to the polling, above 50%, and some non-storefront delivery. To date, because they did no retail, there are no applications for any cannabis use in or usage at all in City of San Carlos. I spoke with Al Save, the director of planning, and he said that there just is no interest. And it goes back to the point that the gentleman made before. You're in a very urban area. Cultivation, if you don't grow tomatoes here, you're really not going to grow cannabis here. Manufacturing, it's so expensive to get property, lease property, or anything like that. You're really, what you have here is a wealthy electorate population who have a high demand for the product. They're currently going to San Jose and purchasing it there. And that's really where you should be looking at your focus. I agree with them on 1 per 15,000 as far as population. But that's really a decision for you and the city council to make. And then also the non-storefront delivery. Don't miss that whole aspect of not having actual storefronts, but having delivery source out of Santa Clara. That's a large revenue source that you could cash in on. So I just wanted to emphasize the retail. San Carlos is a perfect example of when you don't do it, they won't come.
Thank you very much. I actually do have a card now. Victor Gomez.
Hey, Honorable Vice Mayor, members of the council, Victor Gomez with Pinnacle Strategy, local lobbying and consulting firm. Just wanted to address you folks on a couple of points. First of all, cultivation. I come from Hollister. Hollister has already dispensed about 24 permits for a variety of uses. They include manufacturing, cultivation, and dispensing. But cultivation up here in the Silicon Valley doesn't make much sense. So just something to take into consideration as you consider cultivation. You should likely consider leaving that to the professionals in the agricultural fields of Monterey and San Benito counties. To Sean Kelly Rice's point as well on non-storefront retail, please consider that. Leave that as an option. That could work in very nicely with your plan as you move forward with retail locations in your city. Delivery is very popular and it could certainly serve your city well. And that goes with the zoning component of it. Taxes, to the Councilmember Mahan's point, the state is going to be levying, or currently is levying, a tax on cultivation and retail as well. And a substantial portion of that revenue is going to be dedicated for DUI purposes. So for the enforcement side of it, I just wanted to make it clear that state revenues will be allocated for that purpose. But again, thank you to staff and to your consultant here as well for the presentation, and we look forward as you guys continue to plow forward on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, anybody else would like to speak from the public? Okay. Okay, city manager, I understand that what you need from us today is authority to propose a sales tax initiative, to prepare a sales tax initiative for the ballot. Is that correct?
Well, we're moving forward and we'll bring back some options. And as this is a study session, we're just seeking input from the council, which we've received today. And we wanted to distinguish that we are moving forward on the revenue part, both the fees and more particularly the tax, so that we bring that back according to the required deadlines. But we will continue with developing the regulatory program and bring back at appropriate times for engagement with the council.
So you don't need
No,
consensus from
there's
us?
no, we're fine with what the council has already provided. Thank
Okay,
you.
then thank you very much. Okay, so we are done with that study session, and thank you very much for all of the input. We look forward to hearing back from you in the future.
We have another study session.
Item for the study session is the preliminary evaluation of living wage for individuals working in city-owned facilities.
We're pulling up the PowerPoint and getting
Yes.
ourselves.
I'm pulling my information together too.
Here we go. Thank you.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you.
So this is the second study session, and what we're bringing today is an introduction of our research as well as some of the components to put together for a living wage ordinance. Ronnie and I will be providing the presentation, and we wanted to walk you through a series of slides of what our research is surfacing, so that as the council wants to proceed, you can provide some input as well as some next steps and know in which direction this would follow. We also want to call out some areas of barrier that came up very prominently in the last at the last goal setting session over 2 days, and we'll cover those as we get through the presentation. So for today, we're going to cover background and policy overview, regional living wage policies, potential applicability, and the monitoring and enforcement options, and then have a discussion around next steps. So we, just for purposes of getting ourselves all on the same page, we know that living wage is not to be confused with minimum wage or prevailing wage, and that the living wage is sufficient to meet basic needs and avoid economic hardships so that full-time workers can support a family of 3 or 4. And it's based on both hourly rates as well as the benefits and other programmatic elements of an employment status. So here we're showing the living wage as it exists for Bay Area cities. As already stated, it requires employees to pay wages, in this case above federal or state minimum wage levels, specific to workers employed by firms that have contracts with cities or county governments. And right now for the Bay Area, the living wage is between $14 to $21.92. Minimum wage, the city council is familiar with that. The city has already taken action to implement a minimum wage. As well as prevailing wage, there's been several actions by the state. And in this case, the prevailing wage is all workers employed on public works projects that must be paid a specific wage according to particular work classifications determined by the California Department of Industrial Relations. And it depends based on what type of work and classification, and it's adjusted during the months of March and August. So for background, living wage movement dates back to 1994 when the city of Baltimore initiated a Living Wage Act. We have California has been at the forefront of putting in place these policies. We showed some California jurisdictions with the living wage ordinance, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically about some cities that we chose to study and bring forward to the City Council today. The first thing to understand is a living wage is determined by a set of assumptions for a family unit to determine the hourly wage to achieve affordability within a region. And despite common goals, living wage policies vary in practice, and they vary in terms of how the program is designed. And because of that, we do want to bring to you several elements of the program so that the council can put forward information within the context of our organization and our community. Each living wage ordinance is tailored, as I just mentioned, to needs of the community and the issues that we're trying to impact. A living wage policy is a community value statement for concern with wage growth and fair compensation, for economic opportunity through the use of public funds, to establish quality of employment through the different highlighted sections there, everything from healthcare, voice at work, retention policies, and overall benefit programs, and a cost of living and affordability to meet basic needs. Potential desired impacts for living wage, of course, has always comes up during this conversation, is to reduce poverty in urban areas, benefit working families, increase productivity, reduce turnover, improve morale, and bring needed purchasing power for low-income communities. On the municipal side, potential impacts include annual increases in contract costs based on negotiations and how the policy is developed, cost increase pass-throughs to contracts, cost of increases, they could be paid through lower profits and efficiency gains due to higher productivity and reduced turnover, or absorption by firms may lead to minimum pass-throughs onto municipal government contracts. There's also issues of wage compensation. This occurred when the City Council increased the minimum wage, and that there is a spillover effect of adjustments for higher paid employees and areas where compaction needs to be maintained. From a business climate perspective, what's important to consider here is that it may have an impact on number of bidders depending on how the policy is developed. It could have a positive impact. We have seen that in our research. It could have a neutral or negative impact as well. The potential financial impact on the business, this comes forward with a need for strong engagement with the impacted businesses so we know what's important to them as we consider developing a policy. And it enhances service worker competitiveness with attracting employees due to higher wages in the region and potential reduction in turnover. And we also need to understand the business climate impacts unknown, absent an engagement process. And I'll invite Rania when she comes to present her slides to comment on that, because there is some interesting research that we found that's worth sharing with respect to the lack of engagement or perhaps not complete engagement and the impacts that could happen there that we have on record. So it's how is the living wage calculated? There's no single adopted methodology for establishing living wage, but generally there's a couple of methods for calculation in that you can consult the federal program guidelines and then establish a range of percentages as to where you would like to place employees, negotiation with labor groups, or living wage calculators and tools. And so we'll look at what we do here in Santa Clara County. And they have a multiplier effect that establishes, for instance, the San Jose living wage, where they look at the federal poverty income standard for a family of 3, and then they multiply that by a geographic adjustment factor to capture cost of living and to meet the target of the goals that were established earlier with respect to affordability in the region. And with the calculation that is provided, what is the number that's being yielded right now is a wage with health benefits is $20.57, and without benefits, it's $21.82. So evaluation of the tool is very important as we think through the program and the policy implications. Cities with administrative capacity to evaluate the effects of the living wage ordinance typically evaluate the workforce impact, cost, enforcement, and compliance. And San Jose has recently completed work on understanding the impacts of the living wage. And here, if you look at the second bullet, the workforce impact, this is some of the information based on the program evaluation and looking at the program outcomes. So there was five living wage contracts issued in total for about $437,000. They found that 55 low-wage workers were impacted, 51% received an increase, 15% received health benefits, and 61% of those resided in San Jose. So understanding how the policy is attaining goals is important, and here's an example of what the City of San Jose was able to monitor. So I'll invite Rania up. You want this? Sure.
Good evening, Vice Mayor and Council. So to continue in presenting our evaluation, staff looked at ordinances of several jurisdictions in California that currently have living wage ordinances, and also conducted meetings with staff members of those jurisdictions as an effort to understand its applicability, implementation, and enforcement. So in the next few slides, I will review some of the provisions included in living wage ordinances or policies. And you may notice that one of the takeaways here is that there is no model ordinance, and that each jurisdiction develops its policy according to its community. They vary in rates, as you can see here, from $14 to $21.82. They also vary in applicability, whether or not they apply them to nonprofit organizations, and the value threshold of which contracts they're applied to. And also, a lot of the jurisdictions also tend to apply them to organizations that receive financial funds from the city. And that also varies across jurisdictions as well. And some don't include those type of organizations. In addition, the determination of how much time is spent on implementing the service for the jurisdiction also varies across jurisdictions. Other provisions that are included are typically included in living wage ordinances is also how it's applied to small businesses. Some jurisdictions do exempt small businesses if there is proof of hardship, and some actually define an absolute standard depending on how many employees they have. Also, jurisdictions vary in enforcement and the number of employees dedicated to enforcement, depending on the level of enforcement. So some jurisdictions do oversee living wage ordinances out of their contract management offices and procurement offices, and some have established separate offices to oversee labor standard programs such as living wage and minimum wage and prevailing wage. San Francisco has its own separate office called the Office of Labor Standards and Enforcement, in addition to San Jose as well. Santa Clara County is actually in process of transitioning and will actually be establishing an Office of Labor and Standards Enforcement effective July 1st, 2018. But for the meantime, they have kept it within their contracting management office. And if you also notice the number of full-time equivalents or employees dedicated to overseeing the living wage ordinances, they do vary as well. Some of them do have complaint-driven models of enforcement, such as Santa Cruz, and some do have a more proactive model of enforcement in which they do monitor, they do site visits, they ask for payroll records to ensure compliance. Some of the jurisdictions that we surveyed also include worker retention provisions within their ordinances, and some do not. And San Diego and San Francisco actually have separate worker retention ordinances, just as Santa Clara has its own worker retention ordinance, and some have included worker retention provision within their living wage ordinance, such as San Jose. Labor peace provision as well, or the assurance of continued service, has also been included in many of the living wage ordinances that we looked at. Santa Clara County is actually looking to amend its ordinance to include that as well. In reviewing the ordinances of these 6 jurisdictions, we also found that they do not apply living wage ordinances to their own employees due to collective bargaining agreements, except for San Jose. About half of the cities interviewed also apply living wage ordinances to leaseholders, such as Oakland, San Diego, and San Francisco. And regarding coverage of employees, that tends to vary. A majority of cities do not apply it to their temporary employees, but do apply it to part-time employees. Several jurisdictions are currently updating their policies and transitioning to a more proactive regular audit model of enforcement. And as I mentioned, San Diego and Santa Clara County are one of those. Also, other trends in living wage implementation includes establishment of separate offices to oversee such ordinances. And in addition, jurisdictions have also taken a little bit further and looked at other policies that provide working families with economic stability and opportunities for access to quality jobs. So as mentioned, each city really takes the time to craft its own living wage ordinance based on its community, and this also applies determination of exemptions. And so some cities do exempt nonprofits, some do not. Santa Clara County is actually looking to amend its ordinance to include application or to include nonprofits. Small businesses as well are considered. Typically, contracts regarding purchase of goods are not included, collective bargaining agreements, and professional consultant contracts. So we did take the time to evaluate if a living wage ordinance were applied to Santa Clara, which facilities would fall under that. Basically, it would be applied to individuals working in 7 city-owned facilities, as listed here on the slide. And they would be applied to workers that provide a direct service to our residents. In addition, there are, here's a glimpse of some of the categories of service that a living wage ordinance would be applied to. However, a complete evaluation, determination of the contracts, the value threshold as to what this ordinance would apply to, how many employees would actually be impacted by such an ordinance, will still need further evaluation, extensive evaluation of each contract. Now, if the council were to express interest in pursuing further evaluation, we have proposed here a work plan and timeline that would be required, to consider and implement such a policy. This work plan is proposed to occur over the course of a year and would include a number of updates to council for feedback and direction. It would also include extensive evaluation of our contracts, as I mentioned, applicable categories of service, potential workforce impact, and cost implications. Stakeholder outreach is actually key in a living wage ordinance. It is key for effectiveness and also including community engagement. It helps the organization craft the policy, the provisions, and also assess the magnitude of impact that it could likely have, in addition to the possibility of contract negotiations. Now, I did talk a little bit, I did mention the importance of community outreach and including stakeholders in the process. And the reason why is, in addition to evaluating the ordinances of jurisdictions, the current ordinances that are in place, there are actually also cities who have actually implemented ordinances and were actually repealed. It is rare, but it does happen. And the lesson learned from those instances is that it is important to fully engage the community and stakeholders, and to also ensure that we have key resources for evaluation of the ordinance, so that way that we can, make amendments or change the ordinance based on feedback from our community and stakeholders. Okay, so I'll turn that over to Tina.
Can you hear me now? All right. So I'm going to go back to this slide and just add a little bit more detail than what Rania put forward, and particularly call your attention to the right blue box. We will need to evaluate the contracts that fall under the categories of service and look at each of those contracts and really understand, once the council begins to shape a threshold, if that's how you would like to proceed, really understand what are the contracts that are impacted and the impacted employees. But particularly what's important for us to also evaluate against is, if these are larger vendor contracts, if there are unique employees that serve Santa Clara that would have the living wage applied to them, and how that differentiates from other employees that may be assigned to other areas that do not have the living wage, and just from a business perspective, receive input in terms of how the business would grapple with providing that service, or how they would change employees out. So we would want to be assigned and understand the employees that would be subject to a living wage, if that's the case, and just make sure that we track them, or that people are interchanged as we try to track payroll and different parts of the policy. So here's the program implementation and the requirements in order to put a living wage process in place. And we talked about administration, and it really depends on the elements and how you want to design the program based on the areas of feedback that we would need. Rania has made a good suggestion around keeping monitoring. It served to be very valuable for policies that where you want to attain your desired results, but also for policies that have been rescinded and then reintroduced. Monitoring and enforcement and auditing and understand the program requires a large part of both monitoring and evaluation. Enforcement actions, this is a very robust part of the program in which you are looking at compliance and ensuring compliance. You've often heard the term wage theft, and you want to protect against that as we implement policies of this nature. You also want to make sure that you have enforcement for violations and noncompliance, and so we'd work with the council on setting that policy up. and understanding the staff implications. If, as part of our two-day session, I mentioned that the procurement manager position was vacant. We have a very decentralized form of contracting, and as well as we lack a contracts management database. And so we would want to move in that direction so that we can begin to sustain these types of programs. And then the cost implications that would come with that. There would be some cost, ongoing cost associated with the program. Okay. So monitoring the policy, revise, we would revise and include required policy language. We'd have to look at our contracts and initiate the changes and amendments in the contracts, establish rules and procedures, posters and compliance forms and things of that sort at the workplace for impacted contracts and employees. Outreach and train department staff and contractors. We'll want to make sure that we are fully transparent around the program in place, but also internally create systems where we can sustain a program, take enforcement actions as needed, as well as report periodically to council on policy progress and required amendments. And I, as I mentioned earlier, head towards an electronic contracts management database so that we don't have to do these types of sustainment of programs manually. Evaluation policy, upon adoption, the 5 areas that we would evaluate for programs effectiveness are workforce impact, the cost of the program, as well as the cost of contracts and the staff that are absorbed, either the costs that are absorbed by contractors, the impact on targeted workforce, the numbers that I showed you earlier with respect to the city of San Jose, implementation, phone calls, site visits, and contracting process, as well as compliance. For enforcing policy, we would want to obtain commitment for compliance as part of our contract agreements and ensure that our contracts include those provisions. Have vendors understand under penalty of perjury to provide information as requested. It's typical to request payroll and evaluate and audit payroll to make sure that living wage is being applied where required. That includes collection of documents, as I mentioned, payroll and logs, investigations as needed, typically complaint-driven. However, on larger projects, you may want to just be proactive to ensure that there's compliance with the program, and administer remedies and penalties as needed. So some examples of violations are you can require contractors to pay restitution, you can terminate contracts or prohibit them from being able to participate in bidding, and you would set the term typically, such as in San Jose, it's 3 years. You could look at other terms if needed. And you also ensure that employee has the right to bring legal action for violation and to advance their rights. So here's what we have by way of staffing and operations. And as I mentioned earlier, we are unique in that our process for contracting is extremely decentralized, and so we would want to start to rein that in and make sure that we begin, much like the other organizations that we covered where there is a contract compliance or a labor standards unit, that we start to build that into the organization as well. So in this case, we showed what the staffing complements are for Oakland, San Jose, Santa Clara, and we're just estimating here where we would be at for Santa Clara, the city. I mentioned Santa Clara, but I was referring to the county. And the budget base are not all apples to apples comparison. So let me just walk you through a couple of the figures so that you understand the context that they exist in. As City of Oakland, an organization that I'm very familiar with, we have through the City Administrator's Office a contracts and compliance that has an average set of staff of 5 to 7 FTEs with a director in charge of that office. And so as for implementing the living wage, it was easy to bring one professional in, and the estimated cost is about $135,000 for the professional, understanding that the systems are in place as well as the surrounding staff, and the director already had a role in contracts management. San Jose, they have 3 professionals and one administrative staff. And these numbers here, this is why I wanted to walk you through, because some of these staff are reflective of Tier 2 cost. And so when we're looking at these, we need to be clear that the total compensation could be impacted by who is in the seat. In some cases, you can have a classic employ in their retirement system, which comes at a higher cost. We know that for San Jose, this is why I could immediately tell and say 4 employees at $400,000, their benefit costs are almost 100% of salary. And so when I asked Rania for the deeper dive, we discovered that these employees were coming in as part of the newer pension program, where the benefit costs are much lower. Santa Clara County, they have 4 professionals, same thing. They have a mix of the two. Here, it would depend on who we would attract, whether they would be classic employees as subject matter experts or Pepper employees. That would certainly drive the cost in terms of who we would, how we would establish the program and the full cost in order to bake into the budget. We also feel that we would need some consultants. As I mentioned during the goal setting session, the universe of contracts and databases are very much unknown. And so what we would need to do, I think I can go to the next slide. That's where we're at. So what we would need to do is manually call in those impacted contracts, and we'd like to hire a consultant to review them and work with us to understand which ones would be applicable, which ones would not be, and better assess the inventory. At this point in time, we really don't have at one handle or one grip what are the contracts that we're working with here, and in turn present them to the council to understand the magnitude of those contracts. So we would really need some outside help to get us through the contract assessment to bring back policy development for the council to consider. We would bring back as part of the schedule based on our review of those contracts, what we think might begin to shape up for policy development, and then some enforcement approaches based on additional research. We also recommend dedicated staff and a technical investment to support this new program. Through the goal setting process, I shared with you some of the barriers and challenges that we have faced with sustaining the minimum wage program as well as the prevailing wage state mandate. And so we would need to once and for all institute a significant investment so that we stabilize these programs before we take on an additional program. Fiscal impact to the city, so there may be increases to contracts that need to be determined based on how we develop the project. There will be implementation and enforcement cost. I already mentioned the consultant, the estimated number of FTEs, and that doesn't include the procurement manager. And then the cost of including city employees if applied. We'd want to look at with the council and have a discussion as to whether we would fold our part-time employees in, primarily in Parks and Rec, and how you may want to handle that as we move forward with the policy. So we are requesting input in terms of the program, the decisions, the areas of program design that you've heard today, and we're able to respond to questions. That was, Brian wanted to add a couple
I just wanted to
comments.
offer just a few observations because I was unfortunately intimately involved in San Jose's rollout of their living wage policies and ordinances. And I just want to make sure that it's just a few observations. One is that largely Santa Clara at this point, in terms of its wage policies, such as prevailing wage and even worker retention, in terms of administratively monitoring and enforcing, we're very much hands off. We rely on the state to provide for that enforcement, and the worker retention is self-enforcing. So this would be a very new thing for us, and something that we are not, as the city manager has shown, is we're not currently set up for, and we would have to set ourselves up just to do the rollout and the enforcement. Another issue which was not really touched on in any of the presentation is the fact that it would be very problematic to apply this to existing contracts. In other words, we have existing multi-year contracts at some of these facilities already. And in terms of imposing living wage on an existing contract, there would be issues there in terms of if we were to try to amend these contracts, we would have to probably agree to pay more to the contractor, and we couldn't really force them to do it. It'd be very hard to force them to do it unless we had built that into the original contract. So there would be issues around existing contracts. The other issue is, which I'm not sure how much you picked up in terms of the discussion, but for example, I think in San Jose's living wage policy, that it applies if the worker that's working on San Jose's work spends more than 50% of their time on San Jose's work. So you could have an employer that has maybe 100 employees and has 5 of them working at San Jose, and they would have one wage rate, but you may not be affecting any of the rest of their workforce in terms of that wage rate. And then it becomes, then you're looking at a mixed payroll and how did they work. And so unless you have something like the airport where everybody on that contract is working under living wage, it becomes really difficult to figure out what effect your policy is really having on an employment situation where the city has a contract. And then finally, many of the people that might live in Santa Clara right now, the city of Santa Clara, are already being affected if they work on a San Jose contract or on a County of Santa Clara contract that has living wage applied to them. If we put living wage here in Santa Clara on our facilities, the workers may not even reside in Santa Clara. It's not something that would necessarily benefit Santa Clara residents directly, even though the poverty level we would be looking at would be the cost of living in the city of Santa Clara. So there would be a possible match or mismatch of that. This is a whole different ballgame than minimum wage. You're looking at the cost of living in your city and what does it take to lift somebody in your city out of that level of poverty. But you may be affecting the wage of someone who lives in Modesto who comes to Santa Clara to work at that facility in Santa Clara. Just observations. It's complicated. It's different than a lot of other things we've done before. I just wanted to have you be aware of those issues.
Okay, thank you. I'll open the dais up for questions. Councilmember Caserta.
Yes, I have a series of questions, whether it's directed at you or staff. First of all, I thought the presentation was very comprehensive. I thought it was balanced. I really appreciated looking at other jurisdictions. And I agree fundamentally. I think what's worked in the rollout twice with minimum wage is that we were methodical and that we got stakeholders in. So about that process, can you tell me, we have the minimum wage now raised at $13 an hour. Has there been any commentary on our process of reaching out to stakeholders and what could be done, maintained, or what should be improved? I haven't heard much pushback, but I haven't talked to every small business in the city. But I know consumers our workers are happy at places like City Lights.
So, to answer your question regarding minimum wage, I have not heard any pushback on our community engagement process. I have received quite a few calls just verifying what our minimum wage is, because especially for businesses who are like in Valley Fair, who don't know if they should follow San Jose or Santa Clara, and just with the increase this year, I have received inquiries what the minimum wage is, but I have not heard any pushback at all yet.
So one of the interesting things that I found is I had sent an email about the prevailing wage to the City Council on some areas that we need to make improvements, and I started to look at how we sustain prevailing wage and minimum wage, and had an opportunity to have all the directors in the room and try to get to the bottom of what the true state of our programs were. And what's become clear is the council adopted a policy. We put some information up on the website and with our contracts with San Jose. But beyond that, we're not really active. And so we're not a source of where businesses can call. And I raised the issue during our goal setting of our business relations need to be more robust so that we're tuned into what our business needs are. But surprisingly enough, in the room, there was no information between our executive staff of how is it that we are sustaining these policies, the training, the outreach, and the relations. And so I do have concerns about the accuracy of how we can answer your questions, Council Member. because there isn't any activity that we are proactively engaged in to support them.
This process is recommending roughly 11 months, and I think we should be methodical. What was the process of the rollout of the minimum wage the last two times? It was less than that, wasn't it?
So I was here, I was not here for the original adoption of the minimum wage ordinance. I was here when we amended the ordinance to increase it to 15 by 2019. And that outreach process was about 3 months.
Yeah, I definitely think it should be more than 3 months, and you know, whether it's a year, we need to get it right, but I appreciate that. My question is, I guess, directed to city manager. We mentioned some jurisdictions that have carve-outs for like nonprofits, et cetera. Do we know if San Jose and the county, even going up north like Oakland, have these carve-outs?
So each ordinance is different. And
So what about Santa Clara and San Jose then?
regarding exemptions?
Yes.
So let's see. So if I go back to, can I go back?
Yeah. So we're on
Oh, actually, it was the slide where the ordinances were being compared. There we go. So, so if you notice, you know, each ordinance is different. So, for example, Oakland's living wage ordinance does not apply to nonprofits, but San Jose's does. Santa Clara County is currently amending its ordinance to apply to nonprofits or community-based organizations.
And Mr. City Attorney, you mentioned your concern, I assume this was a legal commentary, on existing contracts. Can you talk about how some of these jurisdictions have dealt with that?
Typically, they've waited till the contract has rolled over before the living wage became applicable to the new contract.
Okay.
Sometimes you can try to negotiate with the contractor to see if they'll pay the living wage, but then you got to recognize that you'll have to pay the contractor more if you're requiring them to pay their workers more money.
I also just want to talk through the administrative infrastructure in place in these organizations is better organized to receive these types of programs. So already both in Oakland and San Jose, I can speak to firsthand, there's an office dedicated to contracts management, there's technology systems in place to manage city contracts, and there's dedicated staff. And here, that's what we are finding is that we don't have that. We don't have a contracts management database to know the universe of impacted, which would have to be manual. We have decentralized contracts, and so we would have to create that infrastructure in order to sustain a program, which in large part is why the difference between a 3-month and 11-month rollout.
And I appreciate that, and that was clearly stated in the presentation, and I concur with you that if this is going to be successful, it needs to be methodical. We need to get stakeholders out, and most importantly, you know, decisions that we make in the public and budgets are moral documents, and that requires spending money sometimes to make this successful. And that leads to that last question, then Vice Mayor, I'll have comments after others speak, including the public. On the staffing and operational resources page, it's our page 15. Can you talk about, again, the classic versus the PEPRA and the costs as it, you know, I know it's just an estimate. Those fees seem north of $500,000 when in comparison to the county. So are you saying if we hire someone that's more junior under the two-tiered pension system, that cost should be a lot lower?
So when we looked at these numbers, and we were eager to bring some order of magnitude numbers for the council to consider, recognizing that a new program is going to come at deficit spending, I wanted to understand, some of them looked rather interesting, like San Jose. And so in probing deeper with Rania, what was driving their budget was the issues around salary, of course, and wage, but also where the employees were at with respect to pension. So in the instance of Oakland, they have a robust program already established. They only needed one person because they have a lot of collateral duties. So they hired a professional, a paraprofessional person, average wage about $75,000. The person's already in the pension system in the classic. San Jose, as we know, their tier 1 pension is about 100% of salary. And they confirmed that they're bringing in newer employees that allowed for them to put them in the lower cost, which is why the number there is at 400,000. And then Santa Clara also had a blend. In our case, we don't have any staff members, and so whether they're coming in as a classic PERS employee or a new Pepper employee would really drive the final cost, and we may have to make some adjustments based on where they're at if we're able to attract and begin the program.
And Vice Mayor, just from a procedure standpoint, do you want comments right now as well, or just questions from us?
I'm taking comments from the dais at the moment and then opening up
Okay, so that includes declarative statements right now, or comments too, other than just questions?
If you'd like to make a statement, you're welcome.
Sure. Okay. So again, I think staff did an excellent job of presenting both sides, and I just come, as most of you know, I really pushed hard to get this up to this point, and this is in its infancy. And whether we decide to move forward, which I hope we do or not, I think we need to be methodical. But the bottom line is, this council's been progressive the last 4 years. We had the highest minimum wage a few years ago. We're getting there again 3 years ahead of the state. We're the first city in the county to pass a worker retention ordinance. And the bottom line is, let's say you're making $15 an hour. That means you're making $30,000 a year. We have people that are working full-time in this city with families of more than 4 that I see in my classroom, and they're simply not making ends meet. You have intergenerational families living together, grandparents, cousins. I have one student who has 14 people living in a 3-bedroom place in our city. I do agree with you and what the city attorney said, that there's some consequences to this, but the bottom line is, if we're methodical and we bring stakeholders together, and as we can see in this presentation, staff is on top of the ball, all right, we need to stand firm and say, in our public facilities, right, our public facilities, where I know taxpayers in Santa Clara overwhelmingly support what we've done on worker retention and minimum wage, they will get this and support this. We have to be methodical. We have to reach stakeholders. But the bottom line is, no one in our city should work full-time and not be at least able to rent a place in a city that they work in. It's just that simple. And this is an opportunity, and there will be cost. And I am proud to say that there's cost involved, because what's worth it costs something. And in return, this is actually good for business. And we've talked about the virtuous circle, et cetera. So I just really think, my colleagues, please realize that this is the beginning step, but we've been so progressive. And again, there's a human toll when people are graduating high school and college and not being able to live in our city where they have raised and want to live in our city and have been here a whole life. So this is just a first step, and I don't think we should snuff it out here. I think we should follow the processes that have made it very successful before. But make no mistake about it, when we spend dollars, it is a moral document. And I want to stand by people that work full-time and can just simply live in our city. It's the right thing to do, and we have staff to help us through this. So if we're asking for statements, Vice Mayor, I want to move forward methodically. I hope maybe quicker than 11 months, and we see that with the cannabis issue, and I'm sure our staff could do that. I'm not expecting 3 months, but 6 to 9 months, I think that's a doable thing. Bring it back to us, especially as some of us are still here until next December. So I just want to applaud staff. I think we have a precedent, but we need to make sure that people that work here full-time can live here in our city.
Thank you. Davis.
Oh, thank you. I guess after our strategy session, and now this is pretty comprehensive, that we really have to take, I'm in total agreement about the methodical world, but my question is, how many contracts are we not able to, at least pull up and find out where we stand going forward? Some of the contracts, do they have prevailing wage in them? I mean, I'm just curious as to what have you pulled up so far just in this. I know you just touched on this, but Is there some number that you can hit me with?
No, we don't, we have not
You have
pulled
no
up.
idea?
No, so we, as I mentioned on Saturday, I think it was, or Friday, we have no idea what, we would have to call the contracts in and review them individually. And the prevailing wage is a state law, so of course, we have to ensure compliance with state laws, but we don't know what's in those contracts and begin to, that analysis would need to be done, which is why we're calling for a consultant to help us with that work.
Okay, and I guess my next question was, I guess for Brian, you kind of mentioned or alluded to that we have contracts that are out there already. So would they be grandfathered into this after we get to this point in 11 months or whatever that you need to actually get this right?
What you'd have to look at is what's out there. We don't,
And you have no
once
idea,
we came back with, what are the end dates on these existing contracts? First of all, you have to set a scope of what you want to apply it to.
Okay.
So, you have to affirmatively say these are the types of contracts where we're spending city dollars that we are willing to pay more so that the workers who work on these city contracts get paid this wage. And then San Jose categorizes that. They just list out, just like you saw there, certain types of things like, landscaping services or things like that. Some of these things are also covered by prevailing wages. It depends. And then even in San Jose's policy, for example, they say whichever is higher, prevailing wage or living wage. Then once you've categorized these contracts, if you see a category of contracts that you've already let and you have signed contracts where you've already agreed, this is what we're going to pay you and this is what you've already told us you're paying your workers under this contract, for us to go in, if we don't have some kind of termination provision or something like that, it's very difficult for us to say, oh, here's a new wage policy that you now have to, change the economic terms of this contract. So I think we would, once you decide which contracts you'd want it subject to, then we'd come back to you and say, oh, you said these types of contracts. We want to let you know that these contracts are already out there. They're already governed by a certain wage policy. They might even have a collective bargaining agreement attached to them, which sets the wages of the workers that are working under them. We just don't know until we have that set of contracts. And what I would suggest is just simply, cross that bridge when you get to it.
Bless you.
And that's the difference between the minimum wage and the living wage, is that the burden on us for the administrative work to go back and look at what employees and what contracts and the terms are, it's on us to understand that universe and bring back to the city council what is it going to take in order to develop a successful policy. The minimum wage, as you well know, is a very different piece of legislation that the council considered, and it's for the businesses to implement and for them to consider the impacts to whatever financial arrangements they have under contracts or employees or anyone that would be impacted. In this case, it's our burden, and we're describing some of the unknowns that we would need to make further determinations in order for the council to develop policy.
So we definitely need to have this risk management person in here on all of these contracts so that we can see where we are, because I think a contract came back to us because we messed up somewhere. So is there?
Well, it's risk management and it's contract management.
It's contract management, okay.
Particularly, having been with the city of Oakland and saw the port reconstruction and some of the development, we got to the point where we were posting payrolls with the confidential information blacked out because there was so much scrutiny on these public contracts and wanting to ensure living wage compliance. And so we have to understand what is the program that we're going to develop, the amount of enforcement, the amount of review, because we want to make sure that if we attain the goals, so that when we evaluate the program, that we understand what our performance is around achieving those goals.
Okay, realistically, what is probably the earliest date, just going through the 2-day strategy meeting, possible for you to come back with something? Because what you laid out for us in 2 days was frightening. So I just need to know where, you're kind of overloaded. There was no enforcement of minimum wage per se through the department heads, because I wasn't really sure whose job that was. I know we gave that to you to do, but how do we tack this one on and kind of work to where it would be, just give us an update. What is
Okay.
the earliest that you can give us?
I may sound like Brian a little here,
Okay.
like the city attorney. Anything that you do, first of all, is deficit spending, because
Right.
we already saw the red 10-year projection. So the funding of the 1 to 3 staff members, we have to identify what the trade-offs are in order to put this program in place, unless there's a new revenue source from here to when the budget is considered. One of the interests of being comprehensive is because I've already surfaced here some of our inadequacies or challenges with maintaining minimum wage and the prevailing wage. And those are very core fundamental programs that we need to be able to put in place. And I frankly don't feel good if you are approving policies for which then have no teeth and we're not implementing. And I shared that story already. And this is one where we have to be very careful, because the areas that this program's success is dependent on are the areas where our administrative infrastructure is most weak. And I mentioned during this goal-setting session the challenges that all of the department directors mentioned with procurement and how that impacts their ability to put city services in place, the vacancy of the procurement manager, and what that means in the near term for us to be able to recruit and try to centralize more. The departments also raised the issues around contracts and contracts management. And I shared with you, I'm embarrassed to say we don't have an electronic contracts management where I can query and Rania can then know which inventory of city contracts are the ones that are impacted. And that means that we would have to do this manually and bring those in and apply the capacity to do them. And when programs have been rescinded or reintroduced, it rests on the absence of enforcement and monitoring. And if you remember on the second day session, or on the first day, one of the first slides I put up was the council passes many policies. We're sometimes administratively weak in how we implement them because of lack of resources or not being clear about what we really need in order to make them successful. And we have no audit or program management investment. And that is severely impacting where we know how we're investing dollars. And these are the components that this program rests on in order to be successful. And so we put forward a timeline of best case scenario of what we thought we could do with the honest resources of what we would need. And of course, if there's delays, if there's barriers or challenges, I feel as if we've established a good forum where we can raise those now that you understand the state of the organization. But the areas that this program's success depends on are some of the areas where we're most administratively weak.
Okay, so I guess, Vice Mayor, so I guess my comment is, we live in a very expensive valley, and these people, you know, the minimum wage needs to be there, living wage needs to be there, but at the same time, we need to get our house in order. So the faster that we can do that, but I guess we have some hiccups to take care of, but I think that we need to address that issue because these people just can't afford to live here. And to answer one of the questions, there was a small business in Santa Clara that went out of business because of minimum wage, and fortunately, someone bought that business to restart it. So that was the good news that I heard. But at the same time, our worker retention out there is suffering because these people cannot afford to live in a valley. So we have to do something. I guess we're basically stuck between a rock and a hard place right now. So any way we could get out of this, you know, I'm all for it, and good luck.
The good news is that the council did support the desire to fix procurement, further centralize it as part of the goal setting, as well as bring back some level of a proposal to begin putting in place a contracts management system by software as well as by, you know, the capacity. And so those are all moves in the right direction. But how we do that concurrent with this is you know, something I feel, you know, I have to put it out there because I don't want to sit in the room and say we've failed at putting in place the right resources for minimum wage or prevailing wage and then add this one on. These are very important policies for the region, for the city. I believe they are good policies, and we have to make sure that our part of upholding them is equally as strong and supported as the policies themselves.
Okay. Thank you for your honesty.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Davis. Councilmember Kolstad, thank you for patiently waiting.
Thanks, Vice Mayor. I have to say that I agree with one thing that Debbie mentioned, and that is you made it so clear to us during that two-day planning session that that you're really behind the eight ball when it comes to staffing. And if you tell us that it would take a year or 11 months or whatever to complete this study, then I would completely support that. I don't think there's any harm in looking into it. I wouldn't make it a #1 priority because you explained to us there are so many other important things that need to be done in the individual departments in that. City Attorney brought up a great point. If this were implemented, if we did increase this salary or this wage of these individuals, there's no guarantee that they would live in Santa Clara. They still might commute from Tracy over here every day. And the manager mentioned something, we're in deficit now. If this study resulted in additional wages or salaries being paid to these contract employees, we would be deeper in deficit. And I certainly couldn't support that. I agree with you in your attempt to make up for the deficit and balance the budget. I think that's a legal requirement that we're all facing. So I would support continuing to look into it at your pace, at your schedule, and come back with whatever you come back with, and we can look at it. The other thing I would say is, if there's a way you can look at those individual contracts and determine how much money would be required in addition to the $514,000 in additional staffing, so that all the taxpayers and the citizens and residents would know if we did this, it would cost us this much additional money, which we don't have revenue for in the current budget. So I would add those things to the thought process.
Thank you. I don't see any other lights on the dais, so I will open it up to the public. And the first card I have is from Jeffrey Buchanan.
Hi, Jeffrey Buchanan with Working Partnerships USA and the Silicon Valley Rising Coalition. First, just want to say thank you to staff for the work that they've put in releasing this analysis, and certainly thanks to those of you on council who've been supportive of bringing this issue forward. Our organization was really at the center of working with both the City of San Jose and the County of Santa Clara in developing their policies. So we hope to be a resource to your staff. Because we're pretty intimately familiar with how these things have been working. These are policies that have been around for decades, and really when we think about here in the city of Santa Clara, I think Councilman Caserta said it pretty well. Folks are struggling. We have an hourglass economy here in Santa Clara where we're producing, you can look at the jobs numbers of the jobs of the future. You have high-wage jobs. When you look at the top 15 jobs that are going to be created over the next 10 years, you have high-wage jobs, and then you got low-wage jobs, making less than $18 an hour. And so we really need to think smartly about what kind of government policies we can do where we can ensure that taxpayer dollars are going towards ensuring that, if you work hard, you can be able to support your family. I think here in the county of Santa Clara, we see 40% of households that have an income that puts them in financial distress. And so, a living wage policy is one of the few things that you can do as a government, aside from, certainly the minimum wage, which you've acted on and shown a leadership role on. But we've seen it again and again, cities and counties take roles here in the living wage. And so look forward to working with you on this. And just to say, we really would believe that when we're developing a policy that we need to focus on certainly, city employees, but then also look at our major service contractors. Certainly the stadium contracts we think should be covered under this policy. And then looking at, which employers may be receiving other subsidies from the city. We have some edits that we shared with stats. There's some discretion between what's going on, particularly in the county of Santa Clara, some of the ongoing policy. So anyways, we look forward to continuing the conversation, and thanks for getting us this far.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. Next, I have David Urhausen. Thank you very much.
Good evening. David Arausen with the South Bay Labor Council, representing 103 affiliated unions and over 100,000 working men and women and their family in Santa Clara County. And I am a registered lobbyist with the Labor Council for the city. This council has shown that it supports working families by recently passing a strong worker retention ordinance and a minimum wage to 15. The city needs to continue that work by passing a strong living wage ordinance that will guarantee families can house their families and feed their families. And in that, we ask that the city include city workers, workers on city service contracts, workers on stadium contracts, and employees of organizations that receive large subsidies from the cities. And then we ask that the following minimum standards be set in the living wage policy. Pay workers a living wage that is tied to CPA and matches the city of San Jose and the county of Santa Clara at $21.82. Provide a paid sick leave policy, and ensure a voice on the job that includes labor peace and worker retention protections. So I ask again, please move for a very strong living wage policy, and please do it as quickly as you can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth Valdivia?
Good evening, Mayor Gilmore and council members. I'd like to talk a little bit about the men and women that are behind these figures, that are behind these papers. Those of us that do live in the area. That's a very good point that you made, Mr. Kostad, that there are, in our case, I'm talking from the perspective of security officers, we do have coworkers that come from as far away as Tracy, yes, and Fresno, Stockton. But what about those of us who have lived here for generations? I'd like to invite you to consider our position. I myself come from a family that's been here 3 generations now. My grandparents came here in 1906. They eventually, after a lot of hard work, bought a farm in what is now the land that St. Justin's Parish is on Homestead Road. And I was interested when I was looking at the sites that are on the list of places that are under contract. One of them is the Triton Museum. My Aunt Ethel, my dad's sister, helped develop that. Another one was the parks. I noticed that there was something about the swim center. My aunt helped create that too. And right there at that park that's next to the swim center, where they have the flags, the American flag and the state flag. Every year on Veterans Day, I go there and I honor my dad. He served in the Air Corps in World War II. My family has served this community as educators, farmers. My dad worked at the granddaddy of the electronic companies. He worked at Fairchild when it was starting up. And before that, he worked for Hiller. So he was, I would say that my family's a typical Silicon Valley family. They started out in agriculture and they went into electronics. And now I'm a security officer and I'm a caregiver and I clean houses. Why so many jobs? It's because the rents have been rising through the stratosphere.
If you could wrap it up, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
I work 16 to 18 hours a day. The lag between the wages and the stratospheric rents is being paid by our men and women that are the officers. Setting aside the moral issues, please consider the health and safety issues involved in having security officers.
Thank you.
That are sleep deprived. Thank you.
Family history is very important. Thank you for sharing. Hector Ortega, please.
Good evening, Vice Mayor, Mayor, and council members. I am not Hector Ortega.
Who's going to say?
Happy New Year to everyone, and it's a pleasure to be in presence of you again. My name is Joyce Huckabee. I am one of the members, Silicon Valley security officers, actually 3,000 strong, that have organized and have won our first contract for Silicon Valley, including Santa Clara City Council, and we fought to get a union. Many of us faced intimidation, retaliation from our bosses, but we still won, you know. And Elizabeth is one of our security officers, and I know that she works tirelessly, like a lot of our officers do, in Santa Clara, and we're homeless. We live in our cars to provide. Our children live in our cars with us to provide and still work here, you know. Living wage policies in Santa Clara County needs to be included, including Levi Stadium and some of these other city contracts that you guys do have at the table. That was very well represented here. There's a lot of people that are not being represented that come to work every day, sick or not, just trying to make a living for their families. Not to take any major trips to Avaya Stadium or to Great America, but just to put food on the table, a roof over their heads, and they have to make a choice every day. Living wages is really a concern for us because we want to continue to work in the city. So I thank you for your time and ask that you consider this very strongly because you're affected with everyone that comes to Santa Clara, comes through Santa Clara, that lives here. I want my children to continue to live here. I want my grandchildren to continue to live here, but they won't be able to if every time I look around and I can't afford to pay my rent. It's January, rent went up again. You know, it's very disheartening that our children go to school one place and we live someplace else, or we can't afford to live, and we can't afford to put gas in the tank to get them to the school that they're comfortable with, something that is comfortable for them, you know. So we deprive them of the education, we deprive them of the community, we deprive them. So please consider what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Huckabee. Victor Ortega, did he leave? Okay, any other comments from the dais? Councilmember O'Neill. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, please, Ms. Russ.
I'm really pleased with the last two presentations that were brought forward from the city and staff. They were very complete on both the cannabis issue and on this issue, and I hope it's setting a new standard for all of the things we're going to look at, for the things that are popular and not popular, for those on the dais, for things that you need information for and things you already think you know about. I hope it's setting a new standard. Because like we said at the two-day offsite, you're going to base things on data. I think what it's showing here is that we need to have affordable housing, not just more housing. And I hope you're hearing that loud and clear. The livable wage is something that's important. But in the two-day offsite, we found that our city budget is going to be feeling the sting of, I don't remember if it was 72% or 78% of the city's budget is taken up by the cost of our employees, their salaries and their benefits. That's a lot. So if that's hitting us that big as a city, we need to really think about what that's going to do to all the other businesses that you guys are making a decision about. So as we think about this, please do a very thorough and detailed investigation that we can all see and that you'll share with everyone of what the trade-offs are. So that if you increase the salaries of people, who's going to get laid off? What's going to get cut? What's not going to get done? It's not done in a vacuum. We have to make thorough and educated decisions. And there are trade-offs. And those trade-offs are big. So please don't just make an emotional decision to pander to the unions, to pander for votes, to meet the needs for one audience, but not the rest.
Thank you, Ms. Bress.
We have to make a thorough and complete and educated decision on the whole picture. Thank you.
Councilmember O'Neill.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a very difficult topic, and we can't avoid the emotion that's involved with it. When I think we all know people, we all have friends, we all have family members who do not live here anymore because of the costs. And it's almost like the divide is those who were fortunate enough to buy housing 15 or 20 years ago, at least, and those who weren't in that position to do that. But I agree with a lot of things that everybody said. So I do believe that we're kind of in a we're in a very difficult spot because we know that we are having challenges with some of our data management and just our capacity to handle projects going forward. It's almost like we're not quite starting at the beginning, but we've we're definitely not rounding third base on this. And in order to assess, we've got to go back. There's so much work that needs to be done in order to make a decision that shows that we've used good stewardship of resources. And I agree that we need more affordable housing. And so I think we as a community have to come behind that and look at and make some of those difficult decisions about where we're going to build housing. So I'm certainly interested in going forward, but I do think that we have to be very prudent and get all the information and be prepared to do this right. And not once again, not to do something where it's just where we're almost just making a statement which has value, but if there's not all of the preparation behind that statement, then it's ultimately it's not good for the community, and it's disingenuous and unfair and unjust to the people that we recognize that need to be lifted up out of as it was mentioned, we were talking about, we all know people who are living in cars or see them in our neighborhoods. So, I think I concur with everybody else. I do think as I said, we have to be prudent, we have to be thorough, and it'll help us get a handle on doing many other things in the city in a much more efficient and productive way. And that, maybe that's how we'll find the money to be able to staff this program and to recognize that most of these companies or entities that we contract with, because most of it's not going to be our city employees, it's going to be all of our contractors, that we're ready and willing and able to absorb the extra costs that they will most likely be passing back to us. And that's just the reality. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember O'Neill. I think City Manager, bringing it back to you, and well, just to make a couple of comments myself. I'm from the 2-day session that we just went through. We learned a lot, like you said, and other council members here on the dais have also referred to as well. We see this, where our organization is, and as much as I think everybody on this dais would love to see a living wage happen a lot sooner rather than later, we realize that we put our city in a uncomfortable position. If, say, for instance, we have to repeal if we pass something, if we have to take it back because our budget will not support it. We don't want to be disingenuous, as Councilmember O'Neill just said. I think as you have established, we have to put a procurement policy in place. We need everything it sounds like you need to do is going to be very labor intensive. And so if we're going to do it right, we need to take the time. Again, as much as we want to, make sure that, people that we can help and be paid, a living wage receive that, but we have to do it responsibly. I would just add that if there is Mr. Urhausen brought this up, and also I see it in the regional living wage policy information that was provided, a provision for a labor peace. If there is a way to add labor peace to any documents that are brought back to us, that would be appreciated, and also along with a family supporting wage rate and possibly basic benefits, if that could be looked into as possible changes to or additions to contracts. And that's basically all I have to say. I know this is a study session, so we're not taking any action. Do you need anything else from us? Do we need to do anything by consensus again?
No, I appreciate the council's willingness to hear the condition of the organization and to begin to integrate that into your thought process. And as well as the decision-making, I want to be able to be clear with the council about what we're really able to do and the barriers that we face. And so I do appreciate the feedback, and it sounds to me as if there's an interest in pursuing with the consultant and getting started on that process. And so if that's the case, I'm trying to look here where if that's the case, then we will bring forward an appropriation, and I'll fold in community engagement, because we have several community engagement efforts underway, so that we can use a contract person who can do the community engagement for us.
I know you have additional priorities at the moment as a result of the retreat. What kind of a time frame do you think you're looking at to be able to come back to us? By the end of the year?
Well, I'd like to bring back, if you're wanting to bring the consultant forward, I need to bring an appropriation for that. We can get started on the procurement process concurrently. But I will certainly put forward the trade-offs that you'll need to experience and consider as part of the budget process.
Okay, we'll leave it at that then. Thank you very much. We are then going to go into closed session, and we will be back here at hopefully 7 o'clock and to have the council meeting. Thank you.
Excuse me, Madam Mayor. I believe there's an opportunity for public comment on you going into closed session. And I'd like to.
Okay, please give the card to our city clerk. Okay, thank you. I gather you're Mr. Bruce Tishnan?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam Vice Mayor, honorable City Council members.
It's not on the agenda.
Mr. City Attorney.
Your matter's not on closed session.
No, it's not. So it's not the anticipated litigation?
No.
No, sir. No,
I beg your pardon. I assumed
So you should just speak to the open council meeting item.
Got it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Number one, you didn't announce what the items are for closed session, and the audience members still have a right to discuss closed session items. So please return to your seats.
They're on the agenda.
You're
so,
supposed to announce them.
But we don't, the mayor does not always
Yes, she
announce.
does.
No.
Yes, she does.
I can briefly announce them if you want to speak to them.
Mr. Kolstad, could you please pay attention and sit down, please?
Ms. Bress.
Thank you.
Ms. Bress, I'm going to read the list as you requested.
Thank
If
you.
you would like to speak to any of the items that I read the list on, please do so, but please do not address the council members yourself. There will be, one of the items is Calhoun and Horn versus Mike Horn. The next item is Smee versus City of Santa Clara. Then there's Umori Kaku versus City of Santa Clara. And there's one item on which I have a conflict of interest, and I really don't know what the issue is, but it has nothing to do with any of the other items on this agenda. Anticipated litigation matter.
Okay, so as...
I will not be participating. not a financial conflict of interest, but I've previously represented one of the affected parties.
Okay, thank you, City Attorney. Ms. Brest, do you have anything to state before we go into closed session?
Yes, please, thank you. As you go into closed session, please keep in mind that as you make determinations and as you commit city dollars, we have a significant shortfall in our general fund coming up this year and next. So as you are doing things, please consider that every decision you make needs to be made in the eyes of a trade-off of what positions might need to be eliminated, what public projects are not going to be done, and what priorities are going to slip. So what you do cannot be done in a vacuum, cannot be done in pandering for votes, as many things have been done in the past, and they can't be done in trying to get people on your side or paying back public contributions. So as you go into these closed sessions, the public doesn't see what goes on in those, and we don't make a habit of having recordings that the public can look at once they are decided, and to be able to see what did go on, as some cities do. But again, I would like you to always keep in mind, now more actively than ever before, as we face this deficit, and it is a severe deficit, and I hope that material that we had will go in front of the public so they will get to see that, because it's not anything light. I was really surprised at how bad it is. Please keep that in mind, because it is some big dollars and the big amounts of money that every dollar you spend has an impact on something else. Thank you.
Thank you. We're adjourning to closed session.